defying conventional wisdom is also what I want to share a story that some of you are very familiar with this story and some people might not be familiar with, but let me try that, okay? So conventional wisdom underestimated first China-Russia ties. About 2 years ago, they thought Xi Jinping's and Putin's unlimited friendship. There's no such thing as unlimited friendship. They underestimated. But look what's happening in Ukraine war. 70% of machine tools used by Russia to produce weapons are from China. 90% of electronic devices, radars and electric jam devices included, they are also from China. So China is de facto is enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. Another event that Washington, some pockets of Washington tends to underestimate is the evolving Russia-North Korea ties. About 1 year ago, I was in DC, and we are discussing some of the colleagues there, and all the Korea experts there, it's transactional between Putin and Kim Jong-un. It's not going to last. But what we are witnessing is a really deepening ties between Russia and North Korea. And the main point that I want to throw here for food for thought is that conventional wisdom is likely to underestimate what I'm going to say is that what about trilateral relationship between China, Russia, and North Korea? I think it's emerging, but I think it's very much underestimated. And that's where my focus is for today's talk. Particularly, in this year, we are witnessing a deepening relationship between Russia, North Korea, marked by reciprocal military and technological exchanges, right? So you all saw from the news outlets that there are about 11,000 North Korean soldiers. They also dispatched additional 3,000 early this year. Among them, around 4,000 North Korean soldiers were either killed or wounded. So that's quite a big casualty, according to South Korean government. What North Korea get out of this is combat training. North Korea is gaining a very valuable combat training abroad. And also the use of drone technology in modern warfare, which is quite significant, and North Korea was not really part of this new modern warfare. So far, North Korea supplies Russia with ballistic missiles, rockets, and artillery shells. Particularly what North Korea military lacked is air defense system, surface-to-air missiles, satellite technology that could guide precision attacks, drones that I mentioned. And potentially, Kim Jong-un is also interested in nuclear-powered submarine as well. On the other hand, Russia is also helping North Korea with the security of oil shipment, rail and sea trade in sanctioned goods. I was told that you are not supposed to issue visa to North Korean workers, but Russia reportedly also issues North Korean workers student visas. So some North Korean workers in Russia, they work there with the student visas, which is a valuable source for Pyongyang with a critical foreign currency there. And this is what I think is very much underappreciated among the North Korea-Russia watchers, that about 1 year ago, Putin and Kim Jong-un said they signed a mutual defense treaty. And when I read the documents, and analyzed it. My impression is that this is a very important document, very much important document, because what we normally, in a conventional wisdom thought was, very much transactional exchanges between Russia and North Korea is becoming institutionalized alliance. This is, from my perspective, is very important. So North Korea actually, during the Cold War, signed a previous mutual defense treaty with Russia in 1961, the same year that North Korea also signed defense treaty with China as well during the heyday of Cold War. So when I compare the text between the two, by the way, you don't have to memorize everything here. Just send me an email with a Starbucks coffee coupon, and I'll send this document to you, okay? So you don't have to write that. Just focus on eating. That's the most important mission for you, okay? So when I compare these two texts, is this new treaty that they signed last year was significantly broader and more detailed, and explicitly aiming to boost defense capabilities between the two. Interestingly, this Russian defense treaty with North Korea is similar to the 1961 treaty North Korea signed with China during the Cold War. So again, I compare the two treaty texts. And if you look at it here, for example, 1961 China treaty, this is the mutual defense treaty clause here, most important part. Immediate military and other assistance by all means. That's the vocabulary that China and North Korea used in 1961. And this vocabulary that Russia and North Korea used last year, immediate military and other assistance with all means. So it's very similar that the two texts. That's why some of the Chinese interlocutors, they got a little bit upset that, gee, Russians are copying our vocabulary and used in their deals with North Korea. When you are been around in this field in security and foreign policy analysis of China, when you do something and that makes China bristle and upset a little bit, then that means this is something very important when it comes to China's security realms. So my verdict is that there is absolutely no reason to downplay Russia-North Korea treaty. And both commit to, if you look at very carefully read the context, they both commit to relatively automatic military intervention in the end. Also, one more thing that I want to emphasize is that, treaty text is important. At the same time, political will by the leaders are also important. So treaty text itself is important, but then perceived national interest also motivates political leaders to intervene a war that is happening abroad. For example, during the Korean War, U.S. came to aid South Korea even without mutual defense treaty at the time. During the Korean War, China and Russia helped North Korea even without mutual defense treaty because they thought that this Korean War and the U.S. military intervention undermines their own national security interest. So texts are important. At the same time, the political will and perceived national interest, they also matter. So we have to look at both together. And when I did that, I get the strong sense that this text and the agreement signed between Moscow and Pyongyang last year, it suggests the strong contemporary incentive for both Moscow and Pyongyang to treat these treaties obligations as highly binding. That's my conclusion at the time. After all, the fact stands as of today that now North Korea has two legally binding defense treaties with both China and Russia. The one North Korea signed in 1961 still goes. They automatically renewed after 20 years. Every 20 years, Russia just signed another one. So where does this go from here? So I'm kind of setting the scene for today's talk so that two other speakers who are much more important than me, they're going to talk more about substance. So let me back up here what the chatterbox in Asia that I was a part of for the last 3 months or so. This is a South China Morning Post, April 13th. Will Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and Putin meet in Red Square for Russia's Victory Day? So before this article was published, prior to that, about 2 months or so, I was a part of this group that debating this issue. And the conventional wisdom until that time is that Xi Jinping actually does not want to have a follow-up between Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim Jong-un because it would send just way too blunt message, way too direct message of defiance to Washington, just like Cold War era. So Xi Jinping is reluctant to have these three strong leaders from the authoritarian states show up on the podium together. However, interestingly, what changed my mind a little bit was that Chinese scholars and the foreign policy analysts, they themselves brought up this possibility. So I thought, even China was at least those community that was advising the Chinese government, they are discussing this issue as one of the options that might be possible, that what China might do. So I thought, this is becoming a little more serious. If that materialized, then this could be the first public trilateral appearance by Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Putin in May 9th Victory Day parade. And that will send an unmistakable signal of solidarity and defiance of U.S. pressure and global leadership. So, if you look at these three leaders, we are familiar with this picture, Xi Jinping and Putin. They met about 50 times. We are familiar with Mr. Kim and Putin. They met in 2018-19, met 5 times. Mr. Kim and Xi Jinping, these two pictures we are all familiar with. But so far, we don't have any picture that 3 of them taken together. So when is going to be the moment of truth that we're going to see all 3 of them standing on the podium together? Okay? When we don't need all 3 pictures, we just need one single picture that 3 of them standing together in socialist, communist solidarity, axis of authoritarian states or whatever media tended to describe. So I was together with some other analysts in Asia. We are debating this issue that we should take this issue a little bit serious because Chinese analysts themselves are also discussing this issue. On top of that, there was a very important event happened in April 9th. Xi Jinping held what they called, 중앙周边工作会议, neighborhood diplomacy conference. There is Xi Jinping, Li Chang, Premier Li Chang over there. The last time Xi Jinping held this conference was 2013. So this is like a once a 10-year meeting that Xi Jinping held. China is, it's a moment that Xi Jinping wants to deepen its relations with the neighboring countries, particularly like Japan and South Korea, U.S. allies. At the same time, traditional socialist countries like North Korea. And what Xi Jinping said, this is the public segment of Xi Jinping's long speech. Usually Xi Jinping makes like 1 hour or 1 hour, 1.5 hours long speech. But this is publicly available sound bites that Xi Jinping made. We are in a very 重要阶段. We are in a very important stage where regional politics meet with global changes. We are in a very important stage in history. The regional politics meet with international changes. What does it mean? What does it mean? Huh? What's happening in the world, geopolitics? President Trump, State of the Union address earlier this year, viewed as in Asia as evidence of U.S. leadership retrenchment. China continues to view the United States as a declining superpower. Actually, there is a new vocabulary. There is an updated vocabulary. So for the last 10 years or so, China sees U.S. as a declining superpower. Now there is an updated vocabulary to express that. China now sees U.S., particularly under the current administration of United States, as a deep declining superpower. That's the updated version of how Chinese interlocutors, say. So, against this backdrop of international politics, a perceived U.S. retrenchment of global leadership, North Korea and Russia, their booming relationship is unfolding amid diminishing U.S. global leadership. So, people like me and other colleagues in Asia, we are kind of scratching our heads. Xi Jinping could have pulled the trigger in socialist country solidarity, just like U.S., Japan, and South Korea, we pulled the trigger in 2023 at Camp David Summit, right? The solidarity of democracy. Xi Jinping is opportune time could pull the trigger, but he chose not to. And the interpretation in the region there is that Xi Jinping avoided the trio photo op to avoid a complete rupture of ties with Washington, at least for the time being, because China is still engaged in these trade negotiations with the United States. So, to conclude, we are witnessing some trends. Number one, we are witnessing an increasingly militarized competition in U.S. China rivalry. And there are two contending trilateral partnerships. U.S., South Korea, Japan is pre-existing. Why South Korea is at the center? Of course, it's because I'm Korean. So that's why South Korea is at the center. Global Korea. South Korea is the center stage of global. And we are also witnessing emerging trilateral partnership, which I think we should not underestimate, is that China, Russia, North Korea. And that picture is kind of similar to what we saw during the Cold War era, right? So it's not really Cold War, but some aspects are really like reminiscent of the Cold War era structure. And Russia officially invited North Korea to join the combined military exercises between Russia and the People's Liberation Army. So right now, we see Russia, China, they conduct joint military exercise, just like U.S. South Korea conduct joint military exercises. And Russia officially invited North Korea, hey, come on and watch. After you come and watch, see, observe, and why don't you join us, right? That's the next step, okay? And a colleague of mine at Korea National Defense University, his diagnosis is that, trilateral military exercise between Russia, China, North Korea seem nearly inevitable. These folks at the Defense University, their most important mission is to predict and prevent and deal with possible military crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And this is not a statement they could make in a very light manner. So this is something I think is something that we should keep in mind. So my conclusion today as a food for thought is that, we are probably, I'm not sure, probably we are, witnessing a writing on the wall that it's time to be imaginative. There are two worlds in the world right now, Ukraine, also Middle East, and there is some worry in East Asia, particularly in South Korea. Will the next crisis begin in East Asia, including Korean Peninsula, or Taiwan could be? And if that happens, Japan, U.S., South Korea will be engaged in helping Taiwan. And on the other hand side, Russia, China, in North Korea might engage in, on the other side, fight against each other, two trilateral relationship, just like during the Korean War. And currently, the military strategies of U.S. conducts with Japan and South Korea, at least as far as I understand, they don't have any blueprint, roadmap to deal with this Russia, China, North Korea trilateral military cooperation. They don't have that scenario yet. So that's something that makes me worry. I think that's it. Yeah, so I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
So I want to begin by thanking APARC for asking me to talk about Russia, China, and North Korea at this particular moment, because it's a particularly meaningful one. We have just passed the 80th anniversary of World War II, and how Russia, China, and North Korea commemorate this moment speaks to the civilizational agenda that all three of these leaders are pursuing. So Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un all consider themselves to be the latest generation who have taken the baton from their forebears to continue the struggle against enemy forces that want to subjugate their countries and destroy their distinctive national characteristics. For all three of them, World War II is a moment when they delivered a body blow to these nefarious forces. And in the words of Vladimir Putin, it was a moment, however, when the forces of Nazism were defeated but not eliminated. So last week, as we saw in all three countries, they took this commemoration seriously because they want to show that they can take pride in their history and that, in their view, attempts by the West to destroy them by criticizing their behavior in the past, including during World War II, is a way of convincing people that faith in their country's agendas has been placed in the wrong direction, that the younger generations can look up for inspiration to the older generations who fought in World War II and to accept this civilizational mission from them, and that this generation has their own battles, which they are now fighting in Russia, China, and North Korea. So even though this struggle has always been depicted as a continuous one, nevertheless, this moment, I think, is a particularly interesting one. Xi and Putin have said explicitly that they see the world as undergoing changes that they haven't seen for a century, And in December of 2023, in the same speech in which Kim Jong-un said that North Korea would no longer pursue peaceful unification, he said that there were gigantic geopolitical changes in the international geopolitical situation. In a way, they're right. The lives and munitions from North Korea, as well as machine tools, semiconductors, and energy resources from the People's Republic of China have facilitated Russia's war against Ukraine and what they see as a civilizational conflict against the West and Nazism. It's a moment that the Chinese government has been referring to Mao Zedong's famous 1938 speech on protracted war, which was given at the Yan'an Association for the Study of the War of Resistance against Japan, as an inspiration to win the tariff war against the United States, a tariff war that, in Beijing's point of view, as of 24 hours ago, is one that they have emerged victorious in the first round. And it's a moment in which North Korea seems more secure than ever. It has a resilient nuclear weapons capability, a new formal alliance with Russia that, according to some South Korean sources, say has brought in $20 billion to the North Korean economy. And Kim Jong-un is still taking pride in the number of new housing complexes that are going up in Pyongyang as he tries to win over the younger generation. So there is this sense of triumphalism, I think, in these three capitals. But I think that can obscure something very important, which is that how exactly to fight and win this perennial struggle has never been obvious for leaders in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. And that one reason for that is that these leaders historically have always debated just how risky and ambitious they should pursue their agenda against the West. So there were certain leaders in the past who feared that too much ambition could lead to nuclear war, which is a very easy way of destroying their regimes. But leaders in all three countries have also sometimes seen the possibility of a cooperative relationship with the West as beneficial, because trade, technology, and investment would lead to economic development and enhance their long-term survivability. But today, I want to talk about a related but a distinct issue that is less commonly seen. And that is how different views in these three capitals about how to immortalize their regimes have shaped their relations with each other, and also how attempts by each individual country to preserve their regimes have affected choices that were made in the other two countries. So in other words, although each country thinks constantly about how never to drop the gun of struggle, it's never been exactly clear how the gun should be held and what the gun should look like. And this has been something that has always profoundly impacted the Sino-Russian, North Korean relationship in two ways in particular. One is the proper role of ideology, and the second is succession politics. So in a way, it's surprising that ideology and succession politics and debates about them would emerge as such a controversial question in the triangular relationship. Most obviously because Kim Il-sung was selected by the Soviets as the leader of North Korea. In fact, Mao Zedong, in one of his less ungenerous moments, said that Kim Il-sung was a tree planted by the Soviets. And after the DPRK was established in 1948, they decided that they were going to copy the Soviet Union wholesale. In the case of the People's Republic of China, of course, this was a revolution that was inspired by the October Revolution of 1917. Mao Zedong's rise to power within China didn't have as much to do with the Soviets. In fact, one of his legitimation narratives was that he was able to cynicize Marxism and ignore the more dogmatic commands from Moscow. But still, in 1953, the most prominent slogan in China was that the Soviet Union of tomorrow, the Soviet Union of today is China's tomorrow. And 1953, by the way, was the year that Xi Jinping was born. And the man in Beijing who was in charge of running the Soviet expert program, the tens of thousands of Soviets who went to China to help them rebuild after the wars against the Japanese and the nationalists, was a man named Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping. Things started to get a little hairy in 1953. That was the year that Stalin died. And subsequently, the Soviet leaders scrambled to figure out how they were going to save Lenin's project, how they were going to save the October Revolution. There was a lot of fear. In fact, even Stalin was not sure about how well the succession was going to go. He told the people around him that after his death, the imperialists would strangle them like kittens. So the Soviet leadership, they take pride in the victory of World War II. In fact, that's the most unambiguous victory that the Soviets were able to achieve in their long history as a state. But they could see that the economy wasn't going in the right direction. The Korean War was still being fought. They worried about potential war with the United States, so they decided that they needed détente. And they also needed to figure out how, as they moved in a new direction, it wouldn't create loss of faith in the regime. And one of the sources for that fear was what would happen if, as they started to reflect on what had gone wrong under Stalin, that they would be held account, the new leaders, by younger generations because of what they knew during the purges and what they didn't do during the purges. So Khrushchev decided that he needed to get ahead of this problem. In 1956, he gives the famous speech in which he talks about all of Stalin's errors. And this immediately had huge implications for China and North Korea. So shortly after this secret speech, there's the 8th Party Congress in the People's Republic of China. Anastas Mikoyan, a fellow Armenian like me, a person who survived in the Politburo all the way from Vladimir Lenin to Leonid Brezhnev, someone said to walk between the raindrops. He's in Beijing for the Congress. And he has a conversation with Mao about something that worries them, which is the growing personality cult in North Korea. Because Kim Il-sung, at this moment, right as the Soviet Union is engaging in de-Stalinization, has decided that he is going to pursue his own personality cult. And by the way, that legitimation narrative was rooted in his resistance against Japan. Of course, he had to flee to the Soviet Union, Kim Il-sung, but he did have some credit there. There were some battles he participated in, most famously the Battle of Ponchanbo. But the other Koreans in the Korean Worker Party who were leaders, those who had served in Yan'an with the Chinese Communist Party, those who had been grown up in the Soviet Union, they were very worried about this. And they complained to Moscow and said, look, you're complaining about a strongman leader right when Kim Il-sung is pursuing his own agenda here. So Mao Zedong sends Peng Dehuai, the defense minister, who had been the Chinese general in Korea during the Korean War, and Anastas Mikoyan, to Pyongyang to convince Kim Il-sung not to purge these people who had mounted a resistance to Kim Il-sung's move towards the personality cult. Now, Kim Il-sung promises that he's going to do something, but he soon reneges on that promise. And by now, because of what has happened in Hungary in 1956, also that year, when it looked like a communist regime might fall, Khrushchev decided that he didn't want to push these kinds of problems too far, and Kim Il-sung emerged victorious. Mao was not convinced that they should back off. In fact, later that year in 1956, he told the Soviet ambassador that Kim Il-sung might be a Tito or even a Nagy. Nagy, of course, was the person in Hungary who caused the crisis that led to a Soviet invasion. So this was a profoundly tense moment, right, in Chinese-North Korean relations about the future agenda of those states. But then China and North Korea started to get along together, get along better. And the reason for that was Mao had decided that he no longer wanted to pursue the Soviet model for the People's Republic of China. And he wanted to grow faster through the Great Leap Forward. He wanted to avoid revisionism, his idea that something had gone wrong with the communist revolution in the Soviet Union, that they weren't loyal to Lenin's legacy anymore, that they weren't pursuing revolution with as much zeal as was required. And that led to a condominium between the North Koreans and the Chinese. In fact, there was something called the Choloma movement in North Korea that somewhat mimicked the Great Leap Forward. And so they got closer to each other. And in fact, they both criticized revisionism as a criticism of the Soviets for not being aggressive enough against the West. But then Mao, in another one of his regime immortalization efforts, decided that he needed to do something drastic to prevent China from moving in the direction of the Soviet Union, to keep the mountains and rivers red, in his words, and that was the Cultural Revolution. A radical attempt to vaccinate the Chinese leadership from becoming revisionist after his death. And it became so radical that Kim Il-sung was targeted as a revisionist. And Kim Il-sung himself said that there was nothing so terrible that couldn't be expected from the Chinese. And North Korean diplomats were telling Eastern European diplomats that Mao needed Korean ginseng because he was going senile. There were dead Koreans being put on trains across the border into North Korea. There were signs calling for the downfall of revisionism put onto the embassy, the Chinese embassy in North Korea. Very fraught moment. And again, it was rooted in China's own attempts to achieve immunity from revisionism and regime change. Now, of course, the Cultural Revolution was such a disaster that it made Mao's hopes to preserve his legacy impossible, because everyone understood it was a disaster. And everyone understood it was a disaster, especially in 1971, when the defense minister Lin Biao fled. Now, Kim Il-sung, of course, is watching this and thinking, well, if even Mao's closest military comrade, Lin Biao, can betray him, what does that mean for me? And it seems like it was around that time that he started to think more seriously about Kim Jong Il as the successor. There were rumors that Kim Il-sung was thinking about his wife as a potential successor. But what happened with Jiang Qing, Mao's own wife, who was not a beloved individual, may have shifted some of Kim Il-sung's thinking about that. But this crisis in succession politics in the People's Republic of China seems to have had an impact on Kim Il-sung himself, thought about how he could prevent a Khrushchev-like figure from emerging in North Korea. Now, of course, Mao did pick his own successor, a man named Hua Guofeng. But Hua Guofeng was not able to survive after Mao's death. And what's very interesting is when Kim Il-sung visited North Korea in the early 1980s, and he had a conversation with Deng Xiaoping, do you know what they talked about the most? Hua Guofeng. Kim Il-sung was intensely interested in the question of why Deng Xiaoping felt it was necessary to remove Mao's chosen successor. It was also on that trip, by the way, that same exec trip, that finally, after years of trying to convince the Chinese, they accepted Kim Jong-il as the successor. It was on that same trip. 1 month later, a man was sent to North Korea to express China's blessing, and the name of that man was Jong-Un, the father of Xi Jinping. Because at that time, his bailiwick included China's relations with foreign leftist, revolutionary, and communist parties. Xi Jinping goes to North Korea. He goes to the Myeongdae Revolutionary School, which was created to train the next generation of successors, these orphans. By the way, he hardly ever talked about his experiences during the Cultural Revolution, but he talked about his experiences during the Cultural Revolution and how much he hated the Cultural Revolution with Kim Il-sung, who was 1 year older than him. And he also, very interestingly, tried to convince Kim Il-sung to pursue Chinese-style reform and modernization and opening up. Xi Jinping, by the way, was the person who created the special economic zones in Shenzhen. And he brought a man named Xiang Nan, who was the party boss of Fujian, who was pursuing his own reform and opening there, and later on would become one of the greatest mentors to Xi Jinping, to convince Kim Il-sung to pursue modernization and special economic zones. When North Koreans visited Beijing, Xi Jinping was usually the most senior person to meet with them and told them, you should go to the special economic zones. Kim Il-sung, in fact, ignored them, and Kim Il-sung, 1 year after this trip, told the East German leader that we are very deeply afraid that China is leaving the road to socialism. We North Koreans are the ones who are going to maintain loyalty to the communist agenda. And so what's interesting is, in the 1980s, because of these tensions with China, they start moving away from the Chinese, and they want to work with the Soviets. And in fact, they start talking about Marxism and Leninism more. In 1980, they almost only talked about Juche. But then later on in the 1980s, they started to talk more about Juche and Marxism and Leninism together. But the Soviets, of course, are pursuing their own agenda. And figures like Vadim Medvedev, who were close advisors to Gorbachev, said that one of the reasons that the relationship didn't prove resilient is because the North Koreans completely ignored them, right? 1990s, the Soviet Union no longer exists. It's collapsed. It looked like China was going to collapse. One of the only countries that stayed with China and praised them for the crackdown in Tiananmen Square were the North Koreans. In fact, when they went to China to do that, who did they meet? Seong-Hyon. And so now, as we move to the present, once again, when Kim Jong-un was coming to power, what was the first thing he did? Well, he targeted Jang Song-taek, who was seen as too close to the Chinese and wanted reform and wanted new special economic zones. In 2016, he warned of the filthy wind of reform and opening up that has appeared in our neighborhood. And 1 year after that, he assassinated Kim Jong-nam, who was seen as close to the Chinese and had called for Chinese-style modernization. So as we can see, how these regimes pursue resilience and immortality has always had an impact on each other. So I'll conclude with some questions, which is, what does all this mean for how we understand the attempts by Putin, Xi, and Kim to cement their legacies to win over the next generation, and what those efforts mean for relations with each other? Putin is talking about a time of heroes, which is his agenda of empowering people who fought in the war and are loyal to what he wants to do to Russian society. But the question is whether or not his war is destroying the economy in a way that over the long term will make it impossible for Russia to be an authoritarian superpower, and whether the sacrifices Russia is experiencing in the war will inspire people or turn them away. Xi Jinping has said that his greatest fear is that the third generation, in his mind the young people now, will lose to the war without gunpowder, meaning American attempts to win over younger generations away from his goal of self-revolution. Question is whether young Chinese people want to go on the merry-go-round again, and what will happen, of course, after Xi Jinping's death, after he resigns. And in North Korea, whether they can survive into a fourth generation, whether his daughter, a woman, obviously, will be able to emerge as a strong successor. Kim Jong-un has also talked about how the North Korean people never should have to be asked to tighten their belts again, but whether or not he can have a relationship with the West that allows economic growth, even if it's guaranteed by a nuclear weapon, is a big question. So how these countries will be able to, meet the economic needs of their people, but also win them over to this legacy of mission of vigilance is something to keep an eye on. So I'll stop there.
So thank you very much for the fascinating talks. As I was listening to both your presentations, I was reminded of four-letter Korean idiom, 동상이몽, or 도쇼이무 in Japanese. So it means sleeping in the same bed, but imagining different things or dreaming of different things. So it seems to me that Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim are sleeping in the same place, but they're dreaming of different things. There are different motivations behind their foreign policy calculus. So Dr. Lee talked more about the contemporary context, and Dr. Torigian in the more historical context, focusing on the trilateral relations and the succession. So there seems to be this kind of enduring drivers for this foreign policy, this alliance. But in that sense, I wonder if I could focus also on what may possibly set the expiry date on this very alliance. In a way, what are some different motivations among the three? So, for instance, let's start with an example of North Korea. So North Korea usually engages in provocations all the time, and they usually very carefully measure how much they want to escalate, and they rely on the sanity of the international community to de-escalate. And that tactic has usually worked, right? And North Korea as a small power, and Russia and China are big powers, but as a small power, they somehow manage to manipulate or in a way gain from other things as well. So in the past years, as you know, China and North Korea, although they're united by this kind of distrust for the U.S. and the West in the broader sense, it's also true that I think North Korea gets away with things that in a way China doesn't always love at times. So, but it was, and another point is that this time, I think with the DPRK soldiers in Ukraine, this seems something very different. This almost seems like a Faustian gamble, and it seems to kind of deviate or go further away from what it was already in the past. And at the same time, we also have seen records saying that the Chinese soldiers are also in Russia. So what does this mean? Where are we going with this? So is it a marriage of convenience? Or is it certain kind of a symbolic gesture? And if so, I mean, we can see that there's certain kind of a trilateral dynamism there. But when we look at the three figures, I also want to focus on what the differences there are. And I think there's one point that hasn't really been addressed. So next to Putin and Xi, there's something different about Kim. Putin is 72. Xi is almost 72. 71. He's 71, but becoming 72 soon. So to Putin and Xi, the question of what the future of the states will look like is something they're not concerned about, right? In a way, it's after me the flood situation. But with Kim Jong-un, he's 41. The question he has is, will he outlive the state or will the state outlive him? So the question of authoritarian resilience is at the heart of his in a way, the statecraft. So in that sense, how useful is the authoritarian resilience in the pursuit of this alliance? Or in a way, will that hinder the alliance? Because with foreign policy, it's a bit like if we all play rock, paper, scissors, we know who wins immediately. But with certain kind of policies, like sending troops or gaining nuclear technology, or getting aid, or having an ally, or losing an ally. Even if you do rock, paper, scissors, we don't always know who is going to immediately win. And for Putin and Xi, the personal convictions that I did the right thing, my country may have suffered, but they may walk away thinking that this was okay. But with Kim Jong-un, the report card of what he did and what the alliance will look like matters to him. So I wonder if you could later comment a bit about that. As in how there is a distinct difference in the temporal awareness of Xi, Putin, and Kim. Does that give a different texture to the alliance? In a way, like I said, going back to the idiom, 동상이몽, the dreaming, sleeping in the same bed, but dreaming different things. Is that the case? And more specifically to Dr. Lee, so based on the triumvirate in this global, shifting global order, if we were to stop the clock now and check among the three leaders who gained, despite all the hits they've had to take, who gained the most? That's the question I have for you. And for Dr. Torigian, you discussed the succession politics and how Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim are carrying on this baton that his predecessors carried. So, but of course, there is this kind of echo of the Cold War, right? It's not exactly the Cold War, but in the Cold War scenario, in questions such as political legitimacy or ideology, even if the three states had different views or interpretation of what Marxism-Leninism may have been, they still had a clear unifying revolutionary thread that connected all three of them. But this time, even with the Victory Day, the celebration, Soviet Union is no longer there, it's Russia. Yes, it is true that North DPRK generals referred to Putin as Comrade President Putin, right? That's a very interesting point. So North Korea goes with the old-fashioned way, but clearly Russia, despite the nostalgia, isn't the Soviet Union anymore. So the big question to you is, how useful is the term New Cold War? What are the strengths and what are the limits? And I'll give the chance for you to answer first.
Wow. I think you are onto something really. There are many details here that we need to examine, but given the time constraint, I'll just simplify. When it comes to whether this trilateral relations is marriage of convenience, I think the same expression could be applied to the current relationship between U.S. and U.S. allies, particularly under the current administration, how it treats its allies, very transactional approach. And when it comes to North Korea's motivation, when 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, when I was discussing the evolving relationship between North Korea and Russia, my approach was this: North Korea had no place to turn to, because at the time South Korean government was conservative Yoon Suk-yeol government. There was no exchange or economic exchanges between North Korea and South Korea. In 2023, 2024, economic exchanges between North Korea and South Korea was zero. Personal visits between North Korea and South Korea, 2023, 2024, according to South Korean Unification Ministry, was officially zero. And the South Korean government was, in a way, hardline policy against North Korea, doing more military exercises with the United States. At this time, U.S. under the Biden administration was applying so-called calibrated approach when it comes to North Korean policy, which is a recipe for not engaging North Korea. So, North Korea didn't have a place to turn to. U.S. was stonewalling. South Korea was also turning hard to North Korea. And China, at the time, just coming out of COVID-19 pandemic, China's economy was really down. And Xi Jinping couldn't afford to help North Korea in a way that Xi Jinping promised to Kim Jong Il in 2019. And Russia, this new darling, suddenly showed up on the horizon, and it was such a good deal for North Korea. So, at the time, if this is going to be a new Cold War, North Korea is the country that gains the most out of this new Cold War structure, both economic aid from Russia, also military aid and technology transfer from Russia as well. No one likes Cold War, but for survival of North Korea, this is the best environment for North Korea to survive in this, global power structure. From Chinese perspective, China was in a very convenient position. Whenever something happens in North Korea, then global attention, world attention, Washington's attention turns to China and blames China. And this time, China could sit back and watch, in a way, outsourcing, taking care of a socialist little brother, the responsibility. China is outsourcing their responsibility to Russia, while China was minding its own, economic recovery, dealing with the trade war and the bigger rivalry with the United States. However, at the same time, I think many people forget that, China has been engaging with North Korea through economic engagement and personal exchange through all these, pandemic years. It is not reported on the newspaper media, but they are still maintaining a good, robust, under-the-table, people-to-people exchange between China and North Korea. Finally, the kind of 동상이몽, two looking at the same picture but two completely different interpretation. In the past, I thought about this for a long time, and in the past, I tend to see this as a different analytical training that you received and I received from the West and East. So that's why probably the methodological training is different. That's why people, my American colleagues, look at this way. I look at this way. But the more these days, I'm more inclined to think that there is also a cultural factor here that. In Eastern, angle, we approach from the big picture first. regardless of whatever happens here, in the end, even the transactional relationship, I think there is a daylight, and this transactional, marriage of convenience, I think they could benefit each other more. So I look at the big picture first, and then examine the details, including the negative aspects, how this would not work out. And I kind of get the sense that my American colleagues look at it from the details first. Why this is not going to work, including all this Cold War cacophony and the noise. Even Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong and Khrushchev and Stalin didn't get along very well. So we look at from the negative details first, and then apply that picture in your bigger analysis of how the whole picture might not be sustained. But something deeply in my guts tells me that this marriage of a convenience relationship is likely to be sustained, and I don't have any social science evidence to share with you at this moment.
So on this question of different temporal horizons for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping vis-a-vis Kim Jong-un, I've reflected on that quite a bit, and I'm happy that you also noticed that this is a very interesting subject to play with. And when it comes to Xi Jinping, it's so obvious in so many ways that he is deeply preoccupied with questions of succession, both at the top, meaning within the elite, but also how you win over the younger generation to the revolutionary project. And so his father, he was a right-hand man to Mao's deputies for years, right? From Zhou Enlai in the 1950s to Hu Yaobang in the 1980s. And the story of the family, to a certain extent, is a story of the pathologies of succession politics in the People's Republic of China, because China just could not get it right. And so Xi Jinping is someone who has decided that there's not going to be a succession. And I think one of the reasons for that is he understands how easy it is to get succession politics wrong. And so it's also something that we've even seen in the intellectuals who legitimate his rule, saying that those who pursue peaceful evolution, they place their bets on moments of succession, and they hope that they can find someone within the leadership who can come to power and push them into an agenda that subjugates them to Western interests, right? So for Xi Jinping, he's trying to solve that problem by staying as the leader, but he can only solve that problem for so long because he's mortal. And so he's playing with all of these different ideas to figure out how he's going to move forward, but I don't think it's clear to him, and it's certainly not clear to anyone in the system, and that's a real danger of stability. And then, like I said, he keeps talking about how to win over the third generation, because he says the third generation is the most susceptible to the wiles of the West, right? Because the first generation fought the revolution, the second generation witnessed the revolution. So how do you get the third generation to sacrifice? Because he thinks you need to sacrifice to struggle, right? That's why he's a little skeptical of these materialist values. And the North Koreans solved that problem. So in a way, and not only that, but they have a 41-year-old who is leader. So I think North Korea has a lot of problems, but in a way you could see that it kind of solved the problem that keeps Xi Jinping up at night. By the way, talking about continuities across these systems, Hu Jintao said that the People's Republic of China should study North Korea's ideology. And Xi Jinping, by the way, also said that. So it was a very interesting sort of contradiction that he was a reformer, but also was very deeply impressed by ideological cohesion and discipline in North Korea. So they want to have their cake and eat it too, but it's really hard. So, and then on this question of Cold War, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of a sweepstakes right now for people in foreign policy. Is it a new Cold War? Is it a new Cold War? And of course, when you're working with a term as ambiguous as that, and also because the Cold War was so many different things in different areas at different times. But let's break it down to one particular aspect, which is I think what you were getting at, which is the question of ideology. So ideology was a cohesive element, I think, during the Cold War in the sense that there was the communist camp. And one of the reasons they tried to get along with each other is because you were supposed to as communists. The problem is that when you're a communist and you have a different opinion with someone, it's not reasonable people reaching conclusions about a complicated subject. It's heresy. It's revisionism. So it was also a centrifugal force. So now we have China and North Korea who subscribe to Marxism, Leninism, and we have Russia. But I think that actually, in a way, even though they're not all pursuing a bloc understanding of communist ideology, they do have these elective affinities that are very similar to each other. And one of them is this idea of struggle, which is rooted in World War II, which is what they've been pointing to over the last week as a way to accentuate their similarities, which is this idea that they all are defenders of these civilizational projects. Now, of course, if you have the same exact ideology, that makes the civilizational element less prominent. And if you make the civilizational element more prominent, then you talk less about what you have more in common with each other because you don't have a common ideology. So they kind of go back and forth and they play on that. But as you were saying, I think that on the ideological element, I think that we have less reason to believe that the regime the connections are weak than they were during the Cold War.
Intervene 30 seconds is that among the treaties, marriage of convenience, Xi Jinping, Chinese leader, will play the role of a stabilizer among the trilateral relations when it comes to economic size, military power, resources that Xi Jinping can pull through. But as you know, when it comes to ideology, we characterize Xi Jinping as ideological Puritan. He is someone who really believes in socialism is greater than as a political system than democracy and capitalism. And it's a new area in Russia that I'm also hearing from some of my Russian colleagues that those younger cadre surrounding Putin, they are increasingly ideologically driven. That the reason that we need to have solidarity with North Korea is because we are in the same political, ideological system, in the same part. So I think it's very abstract in a way when it discusses ideology, but something that we could probe more exactly the role of ideology that brings together in this 21st century between North Korea, Russia, and China. I think it's an interesting question that we could think about more. Yeah.
So, according to the report cards of that Dr. Torigian and Dr. Lee issued, it looks like North Korea is doing well on the Triumvirate. It also resolved the issue of succession. China seems to be not showing all the cards, but in a way gaining behind the scenes. And Russia, we don't think is doing too well. I think that's the verdict. But before I ask any more questions, I want to open up to the floor if you have any questions. And yes, gentleman sitting. And please tell me your name, and also it would be helpful if you could share your name and also affiliation.
Thank you very much. My name is Maos from Waseda University, Japan, and I'm currently visiting scholar here at Stanford University. I'm doing contemporary Japanese security studies. I have two questions too. I very much agree with the moderator saying earlier that whether this Russia, North Korea, and China military cooperation or the tri-alliance is concrete or symbolic. I think these are very good questions. My questions relate to your big questions. That first of all, I have a question to Mr. Lee. And what is China's view to the recent Russia-North Korea cooperation starting from a few years ago? But the reason I'm asking this is because last year, a very famous Chinese historian, Mr. Shen Zhihua, he is the historian purchased the declassified Soviet classified files, translated into Chinese, and just recently wrote a book about the relations between China, Deng Xiaoping's China, and Kim Il-sung. And his books just recently published in Chinese University of Hong Kong and explore a lot of those inside stories between North Korea and China. And his conclusion is very straightforward, is that they are not have a very good relation actually. Okay, their relations is not very stable, even in the reformist China. Okay, they have a lot of quarrels inside black box. But U.S., Japan, South Korea didn't see that. Okay, he explored this conclusion from very concrete declassified Soviet Union materials. So I'm wondering how China views the North Korea-Russia rapprochement. Okay, that's the first question. Also, the second question is related to the China-Russian relations. Is that I'm wondering, okay, we have just like Dr. Lee mentioned, we don't have the picture of the three. I mean, they're in the same pictures, right? Which means that I'm wondering whether China and Russia is really in that closer ties. I'm asking this question because in Japan, Host Universities, I think it's May 2022, that's a source from the South China Morning Post. A Russian destroyer entered into the Senkaku Diaoyu Island without notifying Chinese side. And the Chinese destroyer need to enter into the zone and ask the Russian destroyer to go away to stop the provoking the Japanese coast guards. So in that sense, I'm really wondering how far, the Russian side and the Chinese enhance their military cooperation. It seems there are some kind of internal struggles within the two parties. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
We are familiar with Professor Sun Ju-hwa's Cold War research about China-North Korea relations, and actually I worked with the Peking University historian. Actually, we co-wrote a piece. We couldn't cover because of sensitivity of many details. And when you look at the verbatim text between Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong was using four-letter languages, like criticizing Kim Il-sung. So it's very shocking if you read it for the first time. But if you read it 10 times and 20 times, it's very interesting. Your thinking changes. Just like what you said, this is a bad relationship. It's a very unlikely relationship. They should be divorced. And why the hello they still stick together? Your thinking evolves from the a relationship that is supposed to be divorced to what brings them together. And there are factors that we discover, ideology, mutual interest, many other factors. So I think this is inconclusive, but I think it throws, gives them more room for research that why this unlikely friendship that was supposed to be put in the trash can still survives, beats the odds, decades and decades, and it still survives in the 21st century. Even Xi Jinping, when he visited in June 2019 Pyongyang, Xi Jinping promised to Kim Jong-un, "I'll help North Korea's economy and security, 力所能及, to the best of my ability." It is very rare vocabulary for the Chinese top leader to use toward North Korea. To the best of my ability, I'm going to help North Korea when it comes to economic development, also when it comes to relieving your security concerns against the United States. So it's very interesting, the dynamics between the two. Just briefly touch upon the Japan factor. When this trilateral relationship evolves, the one scenario is actually touches upon Japan, because North Korea and Russia, when they conduct joint military exercises near the 4 disputed islands in northern territory, right? Japan sees, then Japan's current security focus on Indo-Pacific near Taiwan, Japan maybe will be pressured to, pull some of the troops to the northern territory near the Russia. In that case, this is going to be very messy, battlefield scenario that actually some of the Japanese interlocutors, they begin to worry about. So, that's why this trilateral picture, even though that has not completely matured yet, but it really throws up a lot of different uncomfortable scenarios that makes South Korea, Japan, other countries worry about.
Thank you. My name's Stephen Band. I'm an alum of the business school here at Stanford. I'm also a former British diplomat. My question is, I'd like you to place the very interesting things you've said under the microscope of the Western policy formulation. If you were sitting in a Western capital, and I'm not going to say Washington because too much extraneous noise immediately enters into it, a Western capital in Asia or in Europe, and you were asked to design a wedge driving policy to deal with this situation, what would be on the top of your list of wedge drivers that you would recommend?
$1 million question to both the speaker.
Question. So someone sitting at the center should answer the question.
I don't advise on policy. I've never told the government what I think they should do, and I never will. So this is a tough question for me. But it seems to me that the question is, first of all, what you think you will get if they don't cooperate with each other, and what you need to sacrifice to achieve that, and then line them up next to each other and decide whether or not it's a worthwhile agenda. And part of that question gets into what we've already been talking about, which is how resilient the relationship is, because that tells you how much you might need to do to get them to break apart. And so we've seen these conversations about a reverse Nixon, reverse Kissinger, whatever your favorite nomenclature is. And of course, this gets into a deeper question about what kind of a relationship the United States wants to have with Russia, and what kind of Europe what kind of relationship it wants to have with Europe. And those are conversations that are going on within the United States right now. And there's even been talk about whether or not the United States is going to outsource security to the Europeans. That there would be some role, of course, but that attention would shift to East Asia primarily. It's hard to guess what the Trump administration is going to do, because there are so many different kinds of opinions within the administration, and because the president himself has expressed so many different views and has proven to be such a transactional style politician. But it seems to me that it's certainly possible that you could affect the calculus in every one of those countries to a certain extent, that they may or may not do certain things that the United States would prefer them to do or not do. So I don't want to say it's impossible to affect how those leaders think, but I also would suggest that to lead to a fundamental change, one that's really meaningful, would lead to basically the United States fundamentally changing the kind of goals and agenda it pursues in the world.
I think it really, driving wedge between China and North Korea. I've been hearing this for the last 20 years. Now, driving wedge between Russia and China, reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger. I think it really shows a strategic culture that or how the West approaches. And I don't have the answer, but let me just share this anecdote that I heard. 2011, December 17, 2011, North Korean leader Jong Il passed away. And the American diplomat based in Beijing, we sat down for lunch together. And all the journalists, I was also based in Beijing, all the journalists and diplomats based in Western diplomats, they asked me, "Oh, North Korean leader passed away suddenly, and Kim Jong-un is so young. He's 20-something, inexperienced, and he's surrounded by, all the generals, and North Korea will become the puppet nation of China. And China will eat North Korea and make it as the fourth Dongbei region, Dongbei is northeastern province. Now there are 3 regions, provinces, make it North Korea as another province, that China will eat North Korea. But this particular American diplomat asked me, "So Mr. Lee, what do you think is the city of Dandong will look like in 30 years between China and North Korea?" What that means is that he doesn't believe that China will eat North Korea. China will, and North Korea, the border will be kept and remain for the next ensuing 30 years. So what do you think the border trade and relation between North Korea and China in 30 years will look like? He was the only diplomat who asked that very question, and I cannot forget that experience. All others, they are asking the driving wedge question. So this is also something to think about for me.
Thank you very much. My name is Yingju. I'm currently a postdoc here at APARC. I think we've heard a lot of great reflections on the importance of ideology and succession in this talk, but I would like to have a question regarding the role of economic activities, especially at domestic politics. How does that play the role in this trilateral relationship? Because Deriving from the most of the mainstream literature here, we heard about, especially in China, China currently, because we have lost this communist revolution leaders, and now China experiencing sort of the performative authoritarianism, whereby the economic development has been playing more and more important role in terms of maintaining the legitimacy. So I would like to ask both presenters here, what do you think the role of the economic activities going to play the role in trilateral relations? And we've heard less about the role of economic activities in Russia and North Korea. I would like to hear about that insight as well. Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. So one of the reasons the capitals of these three states have fought with each other and debated amongst themselves is that how you balance ideology and security with economic growth and development is far from obvious. And in fact, when Hu Yaobang, the General Secretary of China, resigned in 1987, he wrote something very interesting in the self-criticism. He said that in theory, reform and opening and the four cardinal principles, which is a very conservative formulation that Deng Xiaoping introduced in 1979, can and should be integrated. But in practice, in concrete terms, that's actually very challenging to do, and it requires a lot of political skill. And so we can debate how much skill Xi Jinping has, but these debates about whether he cares about ideology and security more or whether he cares about the economy more, I think it's obvious he cares about both, and that in theory, that makes sense because he's not so stupid to believe that if people don't feel that their lives are getting better, that it's a big problem. But he also says that you can't have economic growth without a security guarantee. And you can see how that is something that theoretically fits, but that in practice, one of the reasons that different people in the Chinese system are taking steps that make it harder for that to be pursued effectively in a holistic sense. And also the reason that we've seen these sort of zigging and zagging, right? So when it comes to China, and you asked your question specifically in the context of Russia, one of the things that they haven't done is risk economic interests by taking steps that would make them vulnerable to secondary sanctions, at least not in a very big and obvious way. And one of I think the biggest reasons the Chinese haven't given a more full-throated support for the Russians is because they have economic interests in Europe, and there are severe reputational costs to doing that. Nevertheless, they do have a strategic relationship with Russia, and I think they commiserate a lot with their a view of why the war happened. So again, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, and it's proven to be a challenging balance. And in North Korea, right, when Kim Jong Un came to power, it was military first, and in 2013 it became both the economy and the military, and then by 2018 it was the economy first. And like I said, he says that he doesn't want North Korean people to tighten their belts again. And he's building a lot of houses. He has this 20 times 10 project. He's making a lot of money from the Russians, and it's interesting. Do people know what the biggest Chinese export to North Korea is? Hair, because they make wigs, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. But how the North Koreans balance that in the future, I think will also be an interesting question. And I think that what I'm trying to do is, with my remarks, is to suggest that because of these dilemmas and inherent contradictions to their rule, it creates a possibility for people to see, space or at least put themselves in the heads of these people to figure out what kinds of things motivate them.
The terminology, performative authoritism is a theoretical tool that you use to analyze China. Basically, Chinese Communist Party, the way it continues to rule the nation is to show economic performance so that you could continue to rule the country, right? So I assume that you are from China. Have you ever debated this theoretical validity of this theory with your professors? Because you are Stanford student, right? Without just buying this theory per se, because if authoritative performance theory is valid, then countries like North Korea should have collapsed a long time ago. China has in their toolbox, other than economic performance, they also spend more money than military budget in domestic surveillance and security, suppression, artificial intelligence, big data, monitoring all social media content. And there are other tools to maintain the rule and authority of Communist Party in China. So the authority and performance tool theoretical frame is useful, but then this is not the only tool that we could watch and analyze China. On top of that, I think we should also look at the collective psyche and aspiration of Chinese. What Xi Jinping said when he took power, the great rejuvenation of Chinese nation, Zhongguomeng, China dream. As long as we could beat the United States and become the number one nation as we used to be, and come back to our due place, and we are willing to sacrifice some portions of the economy, some portions of other performance. Like, for example, Chinese economy is suffering a lot these days, but then Xi Jinping is willing to spend a lot of inordinate amount of money in science and technological development. This is like a DeepSeek, right? This is a tool that Xi Jinping can overtower, tide over United States and become technologically much superior nation. I think we should also look at this aspiration as a nation that I could instead of eating 3 times a day, I could only eat twice a day. But as long as willing to have this endure this sacrifice, one day when my nation becomes the number one in the world, I think indoctrination of education, nationalism in Chinese education, I think did a more than proper role of educating Chinese young people in that direction so that they could be patient. And actually, Xi Jinping reprimanded the young people to be patient and to cool. You need to eat the difficulties in life, willing to suffer. I think the bigger message is that we have a bigger mission to accomplish, and reprimanding young people to follow the directions of the Communist Party.
Okay, so in today's panel, the Eastern Triumvirate, we talked about everything from Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim sleeping in the same place but dreaming different things. And we covered everything from the succession politics to the biggest export to China being the Whig. So on that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Lee and Dr. Torigian for a fantastic panel.